So, who was Peter? In John 1, verse 40 through 42, it says, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard that John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to go find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah, that is the Christ," and brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You will be called Cephas," which later translated to Peter. So a quick little background on Simon Peter. Occupation, fisherman. Come on, we knew that. Now, what was Peter's first encounter, you might ask, with Jesus? Well, it's only one of the coolest stories in the Bible, in my opinion. But later, Peter met Jesus at the sea when he was fishing, and he couldn't catch anything. Jesus said, "Cast your net over here." And boom, the most fish that anyone's ever seen in that time. One of the biggest catches ever. And Jesus called Peter and said, "Follow me. I'm going to make you a fisher of men." Now, his life as a disciple, we know that Peter seemed to belong to like the inner circle of Jesus, with that being Peter, James, and John. Now, here's my supporting evidence for that. He was there for the healing of Jairus' daughter. We know that he was at the Transfiguration in Matthew 17, verse 1. We also know that Peter was often a spokesperson for the 12. He often spoke first and had a big leadership role. He was also listed first among the disciples in a lot of chapters. Peter was also mentioned 110 times in the Gospel and 181 times in the New Testament in total. Also, Peter was like the main character in the book of Acts from like chapters 1 through 15. He found Judas' replacement. He gave the first sermon at Pentecost. He healed the beggar. He preached in the temples. He boldly testified about Jesus. He executed judgments and miracles. He rejoiced in the suffering for Christ. He was present when the Spirit fell on the Samaritans. He healed the paralyzed at Lydia. He welcomed the first Gentile followers. He was arrested and miraculously freed from prison. Now, we also have mention of Peter in the epistles. Paul referenced Peter as means of a few points to the Corinthian church. Paul refers to Peter as one of the pillars of the church. We also know that Peter wrote 2 books, 1st and 2nd Peter. What was the fate of Peter? Well, we know he died a martyr's death, with suggestion to death by crucifixion. Now, let's look at some of the failures. We're going to look at some failures and positives, right? The night Jesus was arrested, we remember him cutting off the ear. He often tried to impress Jesus. Like, for example, the washing of the feet. He said, "Don't just wash my feet, wash my whole body, wash everything." He fell asleep 3 times while Jesus went to pray. He also denied Christ 3 times. So we know that he swore that he wouldn't deny Jesus, but yet he did it 3 times. He was very impulsive. He was contradictory. He was a teacher's pet. Look at me, look at me. We know he had pride issues. We know he was fearful. He was weak in flesh. Okay, that sounds really bad, right? But what are some of the positives? Well, Peter was the first to go inside the tomb. He wasn't the fastest, but he was the first to go inside. He was the first apostle visited by Jesus after the resurrection. And we know Peter was restored and recommissioned. And we know that based off of him running into the tomb, he was a man of action. He was a man that got stuff done. We know that he also was the first to speak. He also was willing to learn. He obviously had no issues with commitment. We also know that he was humble because he humbled himself before Jesus right when he first met him and said, "I am a bad man. I shouldn't be following you." And of course, we know he was bold and strong in spirit. You have to be strong in spirit to step out of a boat into water during a storm. And if you think about it, Peter is just like you and I. If you look at all the negatives, it is outweighed by the positives. And what's the difference? Well, the difference was Jesus. He got to know him. He learned from him. And the positives started to outweigh the negative things that he did. None of us are perfect, but I think a lot of us can relate to Peter. We have our shortcomings. We are weak in flesh. Sometimes we think that we know it all. And we share a lot of the similar negatives that Peter had. But what's the difference? If you look at the maturity, the growth, the spiritual maturity, well, that started when he started following Jesus and learning from him. And just as you and I start to learn more about Jesus in the Bible, we too will learn and grow in maturity. And our positives will start outweighing our negatives. So for me, Peter is so relatable because of all the shortcomings that he had. But then you see that huge incline of spiritual growth, maturity, and genuine change that all came from Jesus and following his teachings. And you and I can do the exact same thing. He died, but he is risen. He is risen indeed. Hallelujah.